Baudrillard always likes these dramatic formulations. I like to call him like the drama queen of media philosophy.
Baudrillard.
Yeah, Baudrillard.
Welcome everyone. And we just recorded a conversation with Professor Hans-Georg Moeller on Baudrillard for the most part, and then we also go into Heidegger and Luhmann, and we try to make sense of the virtual world or reality, whatever the right word is. We actually then start to center around the question of language and what kind of language we need to find in order to be able to describe what's going on in our time. And yeah, just as a side note, I'm teaching a seminar on Baudrillard in April. So if you'd like to enroll, and if you do so, you can, by doing that, you actually support the work here on this channel so that I can put out these public profiling videos. You'll see more about this in a minute, and so that I can add myself to the build up of the simulacrum. But yeah, it would be good to see you at the seminar, which will be in mid-April of 2023. If you're seeing this afterwards, you just there will be other links where you can support the work. And I'm very grateful to Georg Moeller to take so much time and discuss this with me. I think that he's doing really significant work, and also that we need to find ways of discussing what's going on that are outside the register of humanism, Christianity, so different they aren't ultimately, and also the register of authenticity. So I hope you learned something from our conversation on Baudrillard, on simulacra and simulation. And I also invite you to support the work on this channel any way you can. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. I'm joined again today by Professor Hans-Georg Moeller, specialist in media philosophy, Luhmann system philosophy, and also an expert in Taoist philosophy. And he's recently been putting out work on genuine pretending, on prophelicity. And we are going to discuss today Jean Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation, which probably also has to do with your recent work. I will just begin with two quotes from Baudrillard's essay, The Precession of Simulacra, where we just have to clarify also what precession means. First quote: "The territory no longer precedes the map, nor does it survive it. It is nevertheless the map that precedes the territory, precession of Simulacra, that engenders the territory." So that's been deemed the precession of Simulacra number one. And then here's the second quote: "It is no longer a question of imitation, nor duplication, nor even parody. It is a question of substituting the signs of the real for the real."
Right, yeah. First quote is very pertinent, I think.
Yeah.
Sums up the whole idea quite nicely.
Yeah, if you like, we could perhaps, if you want to say a few words on that very first quote, and then I'll try.
Yeah, that quote is quite programmatic, I would say. I mean, it's a general idea that was developed already before Baudrillard by Derrida and others. Sometimes it's, called the end of representation. An idea which basically comes from semiotics, right? And you can trace it back. That's why they're called sometimes also the post-structuralists. You can trace it back to structuralism, and in linguistics, de Saussure. Baudrillard talks a lot about de Saussure, right? So this is really where it comes from. And so this idea that the primary function of language is not just representation, but that it is basically a system of signs that creates meaning or significance, from the term sign, just by mutual reference among the signifiers. So it's a kind of the signified itself belongs to the realm of signification, and is not something that represents something that is outside signification. That's, I think, the very general idea that in a way was already developed by de Saussure, and then that the post-structuralists who come from semiotics really is really central to them, and that's also what's I think that's what the first quote quite nicely expresses, right? So yeah, I can go on talking, but
Go ahead. Go
yeah.
ahead. Yeah.
I mean, interesting about this also, again, when we look back to it,
Yeah.
is of course that this is not very political, right? That's if you look at other like media theorists already at the time, like Benjamin and Adorno, and their discourse was strongly political at the beginning.
Yeah.
And really what we have, even though it's, 1960s, early 70s, a highly political time. And also you have Debord, who's also very political, who basically employs the same framework.
Yeah.
But specifically in the early Derrida and in Baudrillard, we have this very strong emphasis on language, and more precisely on semiotics. And that's, I would say, like the kind of the French continental version of the linguistic turn.
Yeah.
That you have this reflection, which is neither metaphysical, nor is it technology centered, as you have like with McLuhan or others later today, like whatever, like in we were just talking about this informally, all these discussions about AI that are now so common and everywhere, ubiquitous.
Yeah.
But at that time, but for these French, if you want to call them post-structuralists, it's really the emphasis on signs, on semiotics, on the problem of representation, or the end of representation, as we always likes these dramatic formulations. I like to call them like the drama queen of media philosophy.
Baudrillard.
Yeah, Baudrillard. Yeah. He always has this drama queen attitude for me.
Well, but so here's another dramatic quote. This is just the second page of the essay. It is all of metaphysics that is lost. No more mirror of being and appearances of the real and its concept. Right. That's really significant, though, right? So I think that loss of that dimension leads to the simulacrum.
Right.
And just staying with the first quote briefly again, we don't map the territory. We're not Alexander von Humboldt anymore.
Right. I mean, I like this. If I may continue to freely associate, which you gave me license to do.
You have free license. You have leisure for
that. That reminds me immediately of a quote that I like very much by Niklas Luhmann in his book on the reality of the mass media, which for me is a core text for my own understanding of the media. He refers there, I don't remember exactly, but he refers to this story the famous story by Borges, right? Everyone refers to one story of Borges about this map, right? That the map that they produced this map which completely equaled the territory. Borges has a story. I don't remember exactly how the story goes, but it's an absurd story that shows basically that the perfect map, which would kind of completely represent the territory, would cover the territory, and therefore would no longer be really a map, right? Couldn't function as a map. Now, but of course, that Luhmann also uses this example, I guess, to show that the notion of representation is problematic, right? Yeah. Because if you would have like a complete representation, it would no longer be a representation. So the representation does something else than merely represent that which is not present and make that which is, it does something different from that. And of course, I think that is a core insight that the post-structuralist or the postmodernist thinkers share. For me, maybe even the core insight, right? The idea that which you also find in different variations in Wittgenstein and others, right? When Wittgenstein talks about language and that language really focuses on use of language rather than, again, on its representational function, because that's a traditional idea since Aristotle, right? That language and signs represent. And then we have this tradition in the 20th century continental thought, which Wittgenstein, I would somehow also count him as continental in that sense.
Yeah.
Don't
tell the Cambridge boys. So.
Yeah, that they basically challenge this assumption that language and, in a wider sense, signs are best understood via the dominant idea of representation. And I think that's the core and crucial idea. And that's also represented, that's also expressed in, I think, this first quote by Baudrillard, right? The map, the relation between the map and the territory, that he also challenges the idea in that quote that the map is, so to speak, determined by the presence of the territory, and that its mere function is to represent the presence of the territory. And he reverses that relationship by basically saying the map is something on an altogether different level, and the way it produces meaning is not really dependent on the territory, but it's sort of as a sign, it basically creates the territory in the world of signification. So the primary thing is no longer the present that determines the representation, but the representation, in this case, the map, constitutes the meaning of that which is supposed to be present, namely the territory, but which is never present. By looking at the map, you never really get to the territory.
Yeah, it's very uncanny. The short story is Ecclesiastes, I think, by Borges. It's also what Baudrillard quotes right at the beginning of this essay. Maybe just very briefly, I saw something a few years ago. I think the European Union is, and others are too, where they're trying to build a computer that can map the entire planet in real time.
Yes.
And there is at this point, and that means there will not be at any point, there is no if we combined all computers in the world, they wouldn't be good enough, fast enough, strong enough to run the calculation. But that's for some reason that's one of the projects.
But of course, Johannes, that too is completely illusional, right? Because even if you succeed in doing that, the cameras, they must have a perspective. So the cameras focus still, something in the image is still in the front and something is in the back, right? So it's completely, number one, perspectival. And then it depends on the, how, is it a close-up? And then if it's a close-up, then whatever, you can microscopic, you don't see that. You always see a certain, even if you have like all of the world present and in real time, you don't.
So it's the attempt to represent what cannot, and there's a conflation of what a representation is. So there's a conflation of representation with reality, and that leads to that breakdown of the real.
Right, exactly. And I think that's an important thing that Baudrillard and his fellow post-structuralist, postmodernists realized. And I think it's an important, realize in the sense of understanding or problematizing that representation actually doesn't make the present, right? It's not literally representing that which is present.
Yeah. And I don't have to tell you that the German word for representation is Vorstellung, because you will know. And Vorstellung in German has a lot of different meaning. It can mean representation. It can mean introduction. I can vorstellen. I can introduce myself to you. there can be a Vorstellung in a theater, so there can be a performance
Exactly.
they
Yes.
put on.
Yes.
It can be imagination, which is very different
Yes.
from Vorstellung.
Yes.
Not just
Yes.
a
Always
Vorstellung.
confuses me, therefore, the word Vorstellung always confuses me precisely because of this multiplicity of meaning.
Yeah.
And that's why when you said when you said, okay, the German word for representation,
Yeah.
I was not immediately thinking of Vorstellung, which, of course, you're right, is very often used as the translation. But you just say Repräsentation, right?
Yeah,
The same word, yeah. And but sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, it's just so because the old Kant, Immanuel, he of course speaks of Vorstellung, and in English, because I took Kant in English for many years, and it's always confusing, I think, to English readers because they only have the word representation, where Kant speaks of Vorstellung, and it can have very many different meanings.
Exactly.
And
I have exactly the same experience, Johannes. And I also find then that the translation of Vorstellung with representation is very unsatisfactory. But I don't know what is better, right? Because of the multiplicity of meanings.
Yes. And what Heidegger does or shows with the word is Vorstellung is one of the very important modes of Gestell, of the concentration of positioning, placing, challenging forth, so of the, let's say, essence of technology, of the way in which technology operates. And Vorstellung then becomes also presentation, right? So something that's presented outwards. So it's the blueprint that comes first, and then we're back with Baudrillard, I think.
Right.
It's the procession of the model that then is imposed on the real.
Right.
And collapses it.
Yes.
To a certain degree.
Yes. Yes.
Or completely.
But I mean, that's also maybe the core then problem, and maybe it's a slight difference between you and I. I'm not sure. I always say that, like, kind of, that's why I also call Baudrillard the drama queen, that he has kind of this nostalgia for authenticity. He is like one of my major representatives, for lack of a better word, of this authenticity nostalgia, right? And that authenticity nostalgia is kind of a nostalgia for the present.
Yeah.
Right. When he talks about, the all these, everything ends and the end of the real.
Yeah.
It always has this kind of whining notion, whining, oh, these things are gone, this kind of nostalgia thing, right? And that somehow, so he somehow seems to kind of accuse language and science for not really doing what we were always thinking it would do, namely to represent presence, represent the real, loss of the real.
Well, but look, so if only the model or the computer simulation is the issue is, it's not so much about authenticity, it's a question of whether there can be any let's say experience that's not completely mediated by a pre-format, for example, of the computer simulation, right? That you projections of numbers about cases in a certain instance or so that collapse an entire life world. You can't go outside because we're scared of some invisible entity, let's say, and potential cases that might go up or down. So that is a significant reduction of the life world. It's not about authenticity, perhaps, but of just normal human interaction. Or in the financial markets, we have projections in futures trading that determine basically the fates of entire companies, nation states. Sometimes the price of rice is set in futures markets, which interferes with as you know, rice is, to a large part of the world population, is their basic food. And if speculants go in, they can interfere through futures trading, which is you're not trading with the actual commodity, you're trading on futures. So that to me would be examples where there is an interference, where there's not a longing for the real, but there's just an interference with with the real that is also still in some sense there. It doesn't, and as you know, Heidegger wants to get to a language that is not representational, that is not focused on the presence, but still has not, let's say, not authenticity, but still allows for, that's why he turns to poetry, right? Allows for a more or less, not immediate seeing, but a relationship with world that's not, where Gestell has no place.
Yes, I see that point, and I think it's a very important point. It's basically almost a Marxist point, right? That, you know, it's a materialist point, I would say, and I think that point is valid. On the other hand, I think it's also a little bit, how to say, hypocritical. Because when we're in philosophy or in literature or in the medium of thought and text, we are, and I hate this phrase, but I now use it kind of self-ironically, we're always already beyond representation. So that's maybe what I mean by this nostalgia, the kind of absurd expectation that in the mode of philosophy, in the mode of signification, we can, you know, somehow reach the reality of the real, because we're always already somewhere else.
Yeah. Okay, that, well, but then we have to clarify, of course, what the real means. Maybe you can say a few words on that in terms of Baudrillard and the hyper real.
Right. I think basically, I don't know if you want to talk about the terminology, if listeners, for me, basically, this simulation is nothing else but what is now much more commonly known as the virtual.
Yeah.
I think it's just like the word has now become much more, virtual is a common word that now with virtual reality and whatever virtuality, people now understand that kind of immediately. But at Baudrillard's time, there was still something fancy. And so I think that's what he means with simulation, what then later became much more commonly known and better understood as the virtual. And then, yeah, and so it's basically, I think, an insight in, that's too strong, not the autonomy of the virtual as an absolute autonomy, but, and here, like, I'm basically like Luhmann, I'm a radical constructivist, that nevertheless, what virtuality does, and that's hyperreality, right? Because we're talking of hyperreality. That is, again, like the copy without original, the copy that is not determined by the original, the virtual world, which basically constructs meaning on its own terms.
But is that a new development though? Is that something that, or was that always the case?
I guess to an extent it was maybe always the case, but as you just said, not really to that extent.
Yeah.
Right? Because in previous times, people were actually dealing with rice and not with futures of rice, right?
Yes. Well,
And
people are still dealing with rice, though. So, I mean, that, you know, in an everyday sense, when you go and buy a bag of rice, so that hasn't disappeared, obviously.
Right, exactly.
We still have to eat. We are finite.
Absolutely, yes, yes. But we have, I would say, you know, a duality, and also the futures of rice. There's much more money on them in that than in the actual rice.
Yeah.
Just as, you know, people who work on the rice fields make much less money than those who are in some offices and doing the rice trade.
Yeah. But that, so what I always wonder though is if we say the simulacrum is a copy without original, is it not
Right,
still?
because basically
Yeah,
the price of the rice and the rice futures
yeah,
cannot be explained by referring to the actual rice. Meaning of the prices and the value of rice on the rice market
yeah.
is not in any way, inferable from the qualities of rice.
But is it not okay? Is there not still a somewhat parasitical relationship though with, let's just say, for ease of understanding the real, however fuzzy that term also is, or else it would just be. I mean, look at so maybe that's not a strong example, but Hollywood is at this point, it seems, only capable of rehashing old films. That's basically most of what is, I mean, at
Right.
least the big blockbusters, at least that's one of the
Right.
things that people talk about, right? So and so if they begin to be a copy of a copy of a copy, but there must be at least some remnant of narrative that we recognize from, I don't know, myth or something else, or else it just completely collapse. I remember during the first lockdown, Google placed ads on YouTube, which they own, of course, to tell people to go outside and get takeaway coffee when everything was shut in London, so that, and then leave a review, because the Google algorithm is worth absolutely nothing without the movement of human beings and the constant feeding. So, we need to go there, and then 1 star, 2 stars, 5 stars.
Yes.
Good coffee. This is great coffee. So there's still it's not just a copy in and of itself. So that's something I'm struggling with in terms of understanding.
Yeah, but I think it operates on a different plane. There is no specific meaning in rice. It has, of course, a biological function, right? And we need it to eat and survive for our bodies and so forth. And yet, again, so in this sense, the existence somehow of rice is somehow a condition for making movies or making for the rice market, the mere existence of rice. But again, the mere existence of rice does not in any way determine or create the economic value and trading of rice, which is created in the economy. That's also a basic Lumanian idea. So I think in this way, Luhmann and Baudrillard are the same, that all the economic value has to be explained intrinsically as a construct of the economic system. So that's, I think, a very similar logic, if you will, that you find in Baudrillard, that the whole, let's say, movie discourse about rice or whatever the movie discourse creates, of course, it's dependent on whatever, something, some form of reference, but the actual meaning, the significance is within the referential system of the movie.
So in the same essay, Baudrillard also points to crisis, and says that crisis is used, and that even crisis is not really a resurfacing of the real itself, but that it is used to basically to manage. So this is maybe a bit second question that also comes to mind listening to you is that's maybe a bit spooky. Maybe it's something you wouldn't, maybe you would subscribe to, maybe you wouldn't, which is the question of what technology is anyways, right? It's not, and it's not just Heidegger, there's others also who point this out, that technology is almost not entirely independent of the human being, but it isn't us who's in charge. And that this is what's coming through, perhaps especially with so-called virtual reality.
Yes.
We are basically at the mercy of something other.
Right. And so that's for me, and again, for me, always a Lumanian comes to the fore, who is not just a radical constructivist, but also self-declared radical anti-humanist. He uses that term, right? And so that's this kind of tradition. So that's why I'm unhappy with Baudrillard, because I think the insights are great, but then I think he always falls back in this nostalgia. And that's also the same as you said, because it's nostalgia, you could call it, for us being in control. The traditional humanist kind of ideal that we are in charge, and we as humans must be in charge, and that our being in charge is somehow threatened by the technology, which is still a major trope, a major motive in all the ethical discussions about AI, but also the more kind of, if you want, metaphysical discussions about AI, right? That they basically present the threat to the humanist narrative or the humanist ideal,
or AI is humanized.
Or exactly,
that's the other side. So
that's the other side.
AI is a person.
Exactly.
Look,
yes.
it can. Yes. It can describe how to make coffee.
Exactly.
Obviously, it's a
exactly. Yes. Exactly. That's
even more human than human.
Exactly.
So,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Exactly.
So you see, basically, in transhumanism, which is another direction, which to me is just neo-Christianity, is a promise of salvation, etc.
Yes. Yes.
Those are all based at the core humanist impulses.
Right. Yes. Exactly.
Okay. When we look at someone like Francis Bacon, right, the author of the New Atlantis, one of the godfathers of the modern sciences, who said that Aristotle was an impediment to the sciences for a millennium, we have to get rid of him, and so we did. That Aristotelian teleology, for example, is an early attempt, and maybe also Catholicism, etc. These are early attempts at keeping at bay the technological development. And weirdly enough, during the time where the human being in now early modern times, it assumes itself to be powerful, it actually there's a releasement of this power, and now we're slowly, Heidegger, this is what Heidegger is, a complete non-humanist, right? To him it's very clear that there's no human being in charge of the technological development. It's right. By the way, it's also very striking that the word virtuell is used by Hegel already in terms of memory, and it's used by Dilthey in terms of history, that history is a virtual realm. So that has also right. So that's what you would subscribe to. We're not in charge, and this is now coming to the fore. And Baudrillard basically sees this, but then
longs for right. I'm in my classes, I've been teaching this for a long time. I use one of the early essays by Baudrillard, where he responds to Hans Magnus Enzensberger, this German writer, who wrote in the late 1960s this kind of very Marxist text. I don't think afterwards. It's about a theory of the media. And in this text, which I find therefore so interesting, not that Enzensberger is known as a great thinker or anything, and also that text isn't that well known. Anyways, in this text, that's why I teach as a short text, easy to understand. And Enzensberger says, we should use the new technology. He's talking about television, right? And Funk, I don't even know what that is. CB Funk, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
In the old days, we had these walkie-talkies. That's what they were.
Radio signal or something, yeah.
Yeah, you know walkie-talkies? Do you still know what that is?
I had those as a child, yeah.
Yeah, I had too, yeah. So he's talking about that stuff, and that's kind of, he imagines basically, without using this word, the internet. And so the whole text by Enzensberger is about, okay, what we need to do is we have these media, radio, television, and they function in a one-way way. We should use them in a two-way, so that people become mobilized. and that people become liberated. They're not just passive receivers, but they're producers at the same time. And so this is kind of a first kind of vision of the new technologies as enhancing human agency rather than limiting human agency. So that's basically using technology as a means for the Marxist ideal, which is a humanist ideal, of empowering individuals and liberating human agency, mobilizing people, right? And so this kind of central vision about technology, that technology should be used as a tool for mobilizing human agency. That's the, and Enzensberger expresses this in a Marxist vocabulary. And then Baudrillard writes a response to this and says, this is all basically, it's never going to happen. These technologies are, in a kind of Heideggerian fashion, these technologies, he says, a speech without response. They are just like this kind of technological, in a kind of McLuhanesque way, they are kind of these technological structure that basically do not enhance human agency, but basically constitute, to use a metaphor that he doesn't use, some sort of new imprisonment of man in technology, something like this. He doesn't use that language, but that's a basic idea. They are a speech without response, who precisely do the opposite of what Enzensberger thought this technology will do. They will not mobilize people. They will not empower people. They will not liberate people, but they will create this kind of speech without response. That's the actual terminology, expression that Baudrillard uses. So again, it's this idea that media and technology has this kind of dystopian vision that they are kind of this virtual machine that entangles us in this kind of virtual world, and almost a Matrix-like vision, right? Even though Baudrillard didn't like the Matrix, but he didn't like the Matrix precisely for that reason, because the Matrix still kind of says, regards the human as kind of the source, whereas he thinks once we've entered the matrix, there is no return to the real. Once we're in the hyper real, there is no return to the real.
What would, okay, so given that there is now some sort of better AI than maybe in the 70s, do you think that that's on the horizon in this century or going forward, that it's basically machines or computer programs interacting with each other? Or are we still, is the human being, however you want to define that, still a part of that? Or what would that look like in your, let's say, without going into dystopia, utopia sort of schematisms, but just what do you see on the horizon?
Well, again, I don't really share the humanist approach. Again, I'm basically Luhmannian. And Luhmann thinks that the notion of the human being is very unhelpful, because he thinks that this suggests some form of unity that doesn't exist. Namely the unity of different autopoietic systems, which for Luhmann are biological systems. We humans have autopoietically self-reproducing, cells and consist of human bodies, which are biological systems. Then secondly, we have society, communication systems, and everything, whatever, all text production is somehow social. And then we have, of course, mental systems, we have consciousness. And these are for Luhmann the three main systems. And let's say human existence, even though he doesn't use this term, but that's how I would explain it, happens simultaneously embedded in these three systems. And what Luhmann foresaw, and I think that's becoming more and more a reality, and it brings us back to the topic we discussed earlier, but that's still my idea, which is taken from Luhmann, is that maybe AI can become, let's say, the fourth system, that we could have something like AI are not artificial intelligence, they're not consciousness, but they're also not body, right? They don't live. And they're also, in a sense, not even like communication, they're computing, right? Once they're computing, and I'm not good enough at computer technology to know exactly what computing actually is, just as I'm not as good of enough a biologist to understand the autopoiesis of life, of cells or whatever. But I think it is possible that there will be something like an autopoiesis of computing, and that this will, it's a complex answer to your question, but that this will have, let's say, a different effect, and maybe something post-human, such as the emergence of consciousness had, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago, that in addition, let's say, to biological systems, there was the emergence of consciousness, and then maybe there later on there was the emergence of society in the sense of human society. And that maybe something now, there will also be something like the emergence of computing systems. And then we will have a life world, to use your term, which is not just simply split into three different systemic spheres that constitute our life world. I mean, we have bodily pain, we have toothache, we age, unfortunately. I'm coping with that on a daily basis, right? With that important aspect of my life world. I'm coping with all my mental things, be it philosophical thoughts or be it whatever, being angry at my colleagues or having anxiety or, being emotionally, whatever, involved in a football game. These are all consciousness experiences that constitute the life world of consciousness. And then, of course, we have communication, the thing that goes on my bank account. And when I have to prepare a PPT or when we now talk right away, right? And these things go on simultaneously, right? We talk, that's communication. I have certain emotions and thoughts, and I also have, bodily functions right now as everyone else. And that it might be, again, that through these, let's say, three dimensions that we're all used to, that we're slowly transitioning in some way, that we also somehow are faced with computation as part of our life world. I don't know what that's going to look like, but that's, I think, the possibility. So the normal scenario that you often hear is that somehow, again, these these computers basically, or algorithms, that they somehow replace or consciousness. And I don't think that's going to happen. I think there's something different, and there's something in addition to it. And so in this sense, you could say, I think they kind of enrich, or whatever, in a way, if you want to put it positively, the human life world.
There's one thing, though, that maybe we sometimes forget is that, so I'm using a machine that is silicon based. To get silicon, and then this machine is new, so I hope it will be fine for 6 or 7 years, and then this not very long life basically, and I have to replace it. They can probably reuse some of the silicon and gold and whatever else is in there, but the silicon has to be dug from out of the earth in God knows what conditions. I mean, we can know those conditions. Those are very often, it's basically Africa. That's where many of the silicon mines are. And so there is again, so there is, I'm not a biologist. I cannot say much on, let's say, the autopoiesis of biological cells, but for some reason they do split and they continue to just blossom. And develop until you have a lump of cells like me and like you that can barely intelligently talk to one another, but right. Others can do that better than me, I mean. But silicon does not necessarily reproduce itself, right? A computer does not. So we're talking still about a system that is limited, so that can perhaps program itself if you program it to program it itself, but it's still limited by another system.
So that's right. I think we're there. That's what I always ask our friends. And you know, does it make sense to speak of computer technology as already being at or close to a stage of being autopoietic? And I never really get an answer, at least that I can understand.
Yeah, I said something that came out of our last discussion with Sean, also on AI, that I've been now taking into consideration a lot more is exactly the question of so first of all, why have we no language for it? That's, to me, is really striking, is that we're anthropomorphizing computers.
Yes, exactly.
And almost mythologizing it, right?
Yes.
It becomes very esoteric even.
Yes.
You can get all kinds of crazy ideas about what computers are and how they think, etc.
Yes.
Whereas for the most part, I wouldn't think that I'm a thinking being for the most part, you know. So that even has still these connotations or echoes of Cartesianism, that what we basically are is a thinking thing. Don't worry about the rest.
Right.
And nothing about instincts, nothing about drives. That also Nietzsche already tried to point us towards, right? And Nietzsche has this beautiful section somewhere in the Morgenröte in Dawn where he says, you know, life is exceptional. Life is the complete exception in the universe. We're looking at death when we look out on the stars. We're looking at burned suns, and life is the complete, let's say, consciousness, self-replicating self. So that's an exception. And I wonder though if what, I mean, at this point, I think it cannot. That's what I have a sense of it, that cannot be stopped. It's basically sort of that language. That's unstoppable, because it's two things. It's either it's neo-Christian or it's neo-humanist.
Right.
And those two seem to be sort of fighting over who has the dominant discourse, and it seems that the humanists.
And of course, they're closely intertwined.
Yeah, of course they are. Yeah. But we lack the language, right?
Yes.
To describe what really is going on.
Yes.
We still see somehow ourselves in the center, either as human beings who make themselves by humanism, or the crown of creation.
Right.
And that can lead to all kinds of also dystopian visions of it.
Yes, exactly.
Both of these.
Yes. I fully agree. Yes.
Because
it also leads, as you said earlier, to this projection of human qualities, like they have, you know, the AI has human rights.
Yeah, that's it. But I think it's much, you know, given how we grew up in the West, even in the secular West, we're basically then humanists, and you know, as you just said, there's not that much difference to Christianity. Maybe there's no longer a creator God, but then there's progress, which is a God, and this is the inevitable moral betterment, you know, gloriously marching towards emancipation, or perfecting creation, which is also a humanist impulse. And it's much more difficult and hard, almost impossible to accept that it's never been about us, never been about the human being. Yeah,
I mean, that's your Heideggerian point, I guess. I understand that. I appreciate that. Yes.
But how would you?
But then the question is, isn't that also somehow ontotheological?
Why?
That if you say it's never really been about the human being, it's about whatever being, isn't that ontotheological in the sense that being takes on some form of divine replacement of the divine?
Well, no, it's a bit more complicated
It's
when
a
we get
question. It's a
Heidegger.
completely
Yeah,
open
but
question. I'm not familiar with it.
no, because for Heidegger, that's what onto theology, metaphysical onto theology, is the misunderstanding is the wrong word, but that's how being was understood as, for example, a substantive ground. What Heidegger wants to get to is that there's no ground, not even Abgrund. There can be moments of grounding, but we remain thrown into complete just Ungewähltheit. I don't know, it's just unchosen.
Right.
And he actually says that he said this in an interview with Richard Visser in the late 60s, I think, that he sees precisely in technology a new experience with being, but not being as substantial ground or so, but that we're now that, yeah. So it's not necessarily onto theological at all. So it's not being that is replaced for God or any such notion, but that it's, for a Westerner, a bit more terrifying than that. That's what he calls Ereignis, by the way. That's ultimately the. So it can be, we can think it, we can see it, but and there is a codependence between human being and being. But I think he does foresee, but yeah, so, but we're still at the, maybe that's why you would say it still sort of has a humanist impulse, so because he does say we are at the mercy of it, or of technology. We sind das Spielzeug, the plaything. But he does, so that in Heidegger, what you have is never self-identity. You only have relationality, and the human being does have a place in that coordinate, in the regions of the world or of the universe. So it's not to say that it's inevitable, that the human being was inevitable, or that philosophy was inevitable. It's not like Hegel. But we do need, insofar as we are responding to whatever calls upon us that can be technology, and we just inevitably are responding to it. That doesn't mean we're responsible for we're precisely not responsible. So the later Heidegger turns a lot to Heraclitus and Homer and retranslates passages, for example, in Homer, where if we translate this in our grammatical structure, subject, predicate, object, Odysseus is doing this, then we lose the sense of what's going on, which is just crying itself overcomes Odysseus. Right? There's no one acting. It's simply being, and the entire Odyssey then just shows itself to be just someone being thrown into, and never, there's no subject acting anything out.
Right.
Heidegger really does try to get to the pure event character without an acting subject.
Right.
Without an object that's being acted upon. And that is utterly anti-modern and non-humanist, non-Christian.
Right.
And you have these, when you look at some of the fragments from Heraclitus, there is no act. We can barely, in English, it's impossible, I think, to translate. The German can go in that direction, also the French. So the English a little bit, but there's no acting. So it's just participle constructions, right? Coming together, bursting apart.
Right. Yes.
Not even that which is coming together, bursting apart.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you see in Eastern thought a different approach to this from the beginning, or from its, I don't know, principles or
Of course, I mean, Heidegger, as is known, worked with Taoism, and you can definitely, there's one way, I think, a legitimate way of connecting the connections that between Heidegger and Taoism can be legitimately made. But again, I mean, that's actually, I know more about than Heidegger. The Taoist, the way of reading Taoism are
just
so many.
To clarify, I wouldn't want to ask for Heidegger and Taoism. I want to ask for your understanding of what's going on, whether you think that there's in Eastern philosophy also something else that we could look at, where it's not humanist, etc. None of these Christian impulses, none of the anthropomorphizing of AI, etc.
Right.
No
really
impulse, no nostalgia for authenticity. That's what I mean.
No, I don't really see that. I mean, I think the philosophical discourse, or generally, not just academically, is also globalized, right? And there is not really, I cannot really discern a decisive difference between, what Chinese or Japanese or Germans or Americans say about these things, right? There's not really any essential difference. And because specifically not because they're, if you hear what they are saying, they are responding to the existing discourse, which is like this discourse that we're just talking about all the time. So there is not a kind of a second non-Western discourse that is kind of substantial on these issues. Of course, there are a lot of non-Westerners participating in this discourse.
But it's planetary and centralized on our tradition. So it's basically an uprooted planetary force that is already itself weirdly technicized then, right? Or just
I mean, you have all kinds of niche and Heideggerians in Japan, and there's no shortage of them. At least a few years ago there wasn't. I'm not sure that's still the case, but so you do have that as well. But these are kind of niche discourses, right? They don't really have a very strong influence on the mainstream discourse about AI.
So we have entered the simulacrum basically through that planetary discourse.
Yes, of course.
Where we talk about human rights without having a basis to discuss it, because that actually requires the immortal soul and a Christian humanist understanding that is grounded in something that is.
I mean, I can sympathize with these Heideggerian ideas, but for me, I mean, it's a kind of a poetry, which is fine. But again, like going back to what we started with Baudrillard, I also very strongly, with Heidegger in particular, cannot really fully take him seriously. I'm just talking about myself. Because I see it so much as, again, as a simulated discourse, Heidegger's own discourse, Heidegger's own language, Heidegger's own textual universe is also a matrix, right? And it is, of course, connected with all the text he studies and reads, the ancient Greek text, and also including the Taoist text, and but it's ultimately self-referential and cannot but. And that's so that's how I see it, and that's why I can't really become actually I don't really. Also Heidegger is Heidegger is also a simulation machine.
But that would be really significant to point to, but that okay, so would you would you think that?
To give another example, I don't
Yeah.
know, just, freely thinking.
Yeah.
I would compare it to the composition of music, right?
Yeah.
And whatever you have, and I'm not, I know very little about whatever classical music. You have whatever, like a symphony, and then the symphony is supposed, to somehow musically represent not just human feelings, but whatever, trees or forest, right? And but I think that explains again, like Baudrillard's notion that this kind of representation of the forest is not actually a representation of the forest, the musical representation, not actually a representation. It is a creation of musical and a performance of musical symbols, which make sense as music. And the meaning of the music is basically something that is always has been musical. And you never get from the music to the tree that the music, even or the forest or whatever. And in a similar way, that doesn't mean that the forest doesn't exist, right? And that the forest didn't inspire the music. Of course, let's say the composer has this piece of the forest, and she was, when writing the forest, was inspired by her walk through the forest. But nevertheless, the music of the forest is a musical phenomenon and functions musically and not as representation. And I think something similar, I would even say, is the case with Heidegger's philosophy, right? Heidegger's philosophy of Sein relates to the Sein in a similar way as my imagined composition, the forest, relates to the forest. It's itself, in Baudrillard's term, a simulation. And unlike Baudrillard, I like walking through the forest myself, and I like das Sein too. I like right, but I don't think necessarily that listening to this imagined musical piece, the forest, or brings me closer to the forest, nor reading about Heidegger's Sein brings me closer to the Sein.
But those are old attacks on philosophy, right? And they usually come from what we would consider the
I didn't mean it as an attack at all.
But the sophistic attack is precisely that, is that it's there simply is no, or also the skeptic attacks is that there simply is no way of knowing or understanding or seeing through, let's say, the categories of reason. Which can
be helpful. I don't mean it that way. I mean, of course, I think music is something very valuable.
Yeah.
But if we want to understand the musical piece, the forest, we have to analyze the modes of composition and the effects the composition has, whatever, on the listener, rather than actually analyzing the forest. And I would say similar, if we want to understand Heidegger, it makes no sense to ask in how far is Heidegger's philosophy a good representation of das Sein. Instead, we can understand Heidegger as a little piece of the universe of the philosophical, discourse that developed and that created in itself very valuable meaning and has a certain effect and does certain things with people who read the text, just as listening to the musical piece, The Forest, has a certain effect on the people who play it and who listen it. And it also, one of the effects, by the way, is that it allows musicians to get paid for playing the piece The Forest in a symphony orchestra and make a living, just as some people get paid for talking about Heidegger. And I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, but well, that's a different discussion to have, whether there is representation of sign, because that would imply that sign is an object, etc. But but what I think is interesting is if you say that it is in a certain sense a simulation. But again, if we say this, then this would actually assume that there's a givenness of being as reified before, about which then on which a simulation is then imposed. I think it's slightly more complex. It's always reciprocal. So there's no disclosure of something that's already there.
Right.
There is in disclosure an opening up on both sides.
Right.
But I think also, so I'm very critical also, just to point this out very clearly, maybe so that we don't get we stay on the same page here. I'm also very critical of the notion of authenticity. I actually, by the way, don't think that Heidegger is he speaks of Eigentlichkeit and Uneigentlichkeit, etc. But if we take being and time seriously, then what Dasein is, for the most part, is das Man. And that das Man is not the evil others who take away my authenticity and make, I have to use my, Derrida is actually, and Sartre also, they, through difference, etc., it's the others we need to break away from. In Heidegger, you are what you are is basically inauthentic. You're falling for the world. We're greedy for the new curiosity. Right. There's it's not the herd, as in Nietzsche, that the great individual gets out of. So he's already going in that direction, and then of course it flips back again. So there are these things, but I'm very critical of authenticity, and I see it emerging on the internet. I see people talking about authentic listening and authentic conversation, etc. I find that very unbecoming, let's say, for all the reasons that we just talked about, because I think it does generate sort of a surrogate of sense without taking seriously or to heart what the virtual means. I think we need to try and find the language for it. And that's why I was wondering if there is, but so if this would just also be a niche discourse, because we cannot really change the planetary discourse that already is on the way under humanism and neo-Christianity. So I just wanted to clarify that briefly.
Yes, and I don't really know Heidegger very well, and I don't pretend I do. So when I'm talking about authenticity, and then I don't mean any specific Heideggerian concept, also not the Heideggerian concept of Eigentlichkeit. Again, like when I use the term, I use it as an identity technology that is somehow geared towards the pursuit of originality. That's kind of my definition of it. And somehow the Heideggerian vocabulary, as you just said, can be also kind of, articulate a pursuit of originality. And maybe even Heidegger himself, that's because we're all, right? I think this pursuit of originality is something that I also take part in. I mean, it's my own identity technology, right? And so I think in this sense, in this wider sense, Heidegger was probably also engaged in the pursuit of originality. But I'm not saying that his concept of Eigentlichkeit is an explicit embracing of the pursuit of originality. And yet, I think he is part of this kind of general that he's part of what is very simply put the culture or the discourse of the pursuit of originality that he couldn't escape, like I couldn't.
Okay. That's fair enough. But I think we're always dealing with sort of duplicities in a non-moral sense, double movements. So
yes.
This sounds like a complete cliche now. Light and darkness, day and night. And we would have to say about authentic, inauthentic, we would have to say the same with simulated and non-simulated, or virtual and analog, or whatever the right word still is. So there's never one without the other. There cannot just be perhaps the simulation or the simulacrum or the virtual. It is it. So this is what I would take from Heidegger, regardless of attempts at being a highly original thinker, which he obviously tried to be. But that, so what? Okay, this is the point I'm trying to make, and I hope I get it across. Is that with the now advent of the internet and digital virtuality,
right?
Which is a different, because a book can also be virtual just by the sense of giving force or life or so. So right. It can also be, and there have been other modes of simultaneity, the library, for example, that is less technologically advanced and using the internet, etc. So what I'm trying to say is that virtual, let's say, reality, which is also very fuzzy, that's not going away. That might become, with AI, etc., what you've referred to as another autopoiesis system.
Right. But from my, sorry, interrupt you. So my core idea is, and I'm still working on this, right? And I'm working on it for years, is that this new technology and the whole AI thing, that this enhances this transition that I suggest is taking place from the identity technology pursuit of originality to the identity technology creation of a profile. And that's really something, and again, I'm not judging it. And so instead of becoming all like Heidegger and everyone in the 20th century, not everyone, but a lot of people who are, engaged in this project of pursuit of originality, what we're seeing is a transition towards a different kind of dominant mode of identity these are like, I want to do like an existentialism of the 21st century and nothing less. And the point is basically to somehow better understand, because it brings us back what we said earlier, we don't have the language for this, because we still have the language of the age of authenticity. And it's a very strongly humanist language. And where this pursuit of originality has a lot to do with the ideals of humanism, right? Whatever, you have kids and then you want the kids to be special or something like this. And
that's also very recent. That is very recent. Right.
Yeah, of course.
100 years, because 100 years ago, kids just died.
Right. And then whatever you wanted them to
special.
You gave them the name of your father and wanted them to, continue your profession or whatever, to marry make a good marriage or something like this. But that was pre-authenticity, and then authenticity. But again, like, I think now we're having originality. And that again brings us to Baudrillard. Once now the virtual has become the new normal. And when the new normal is the virtual, when simulation is no longer a challenge, but something that everyone already understands when they are like 6 years old and living in a virtual world, that for them the pursuit of originality also loses meaning. And instead, they develop a different way of creating an identity, of creating a sense of selfhood, and of creating a sense of who they are, and thereby having a very different way of creating meaning. And that this constitutes a general kind of mode of existence switch from the pursuit of originality to the creation of profiles. And this is enhanced and is experienced already by the new generation that grows up, and the virtual world, as enhanced by all these new technologies, is a technology that facilitates this existential mode, or this actual electronic-based technology. Corresponds to an existential technology.
I mean, I would never use that language when it comes to the human being. I would not speak of technologies, but that's to me is only the human being can go to that abstraction. That's always what strikes me as odd about materialists, is that materialists can speak of materialists, but no one else, no animal. But there is something peculiar still about human language and abstraction, etc. But what I tried to say before, and maybe this is not even that, maybe I can't really articulate it, but even with the advent of virtual reality and this kind of finding profiles, when in brackets, we would have to admit that those profiles are now their owned, right? I mean, they're owned by the big tech companies, so they're owned by TikTok or Instagram, which is Facebook. So that's a very different, that goes in directions of then citizenship, etc., that are very different from anything that we know. They're basically corporate citizenhood. But that's not what I'm trying to say. But maybe you can respond to that also, who knows. But my thing is, the virtual is nothing unto itself. You just as you cannot have pure authenticity, let's just say as an example, there cannot be pure authenticity, there cannot be sheer light. You stare at the sun, you go blind. So
of course, yeah, no, it's embedded.
You see only darkness.
Yes.
So the virtual is still dependent upon, for lack of a better word, I apologize, let's say the real.
Right.
And this is where, to me, it gets really really striking, because I think what we will see is archaic forms also of what it means to be human, precisely because there is a breakdown or fragmentation of meaning sources, right? So I mean, profiles of people are sometimes on Twitter is medieval knighthood.
Sure.
I mean, look, I find this, maybe I'm just old, I find it a bit silly what's going on. They call it LARPing, live action role playing. I don't know if you know about this term.
I didn't know
and
that.
no one, I mean, none of these people who put a profile picture of them as a knight up on Twitter would have survived a day in medieval Europe.
Right.
I would guess. But if so, it's not the manager or the politician or even the actor or some other role model of the 20th century, even as silly as they were. It's knights, or it's Plato, or it's all kinds of weird, almost, let's say, archaic, at least compared to 20th, 19th century. Do you know what I'm trying to say? So there are weird new, just LARPing forms of that are not modern, that are not liberal. So that is also maybe coming so there could be some weird, because you need to have some form as the basis for it, right? Even, do you know what I'm trying to say? It's not just what are you going to copy if there's nothing to copy? So there needs to be some basis for it.
Yeah, but I mean, again, like I don't know if that's directly a response to, but yeah. I mean, this is what we are doing right now, right? We're recording this conversation. We're reasonably enjoying it, but at least I identify with it, right? Yeah. I'm truly invested. That's my vocabulary, but it's not a pursuit of authenticity. And it doesn't take place in that context. And I know you're not saying it is. I'm not saying you're saying it is a pursuit of authenticity or a pursuit of originality. I think it becomes now kind of, that's my whole point, second nature to us, nothing bad, that we are both right now within a technology, we are meeting on, internet and that we are embedded in this technology, and within it we are creating our profiles, and that allows us, I think it's not neither bad nor good to be truly invested in it. And that has a lot to do not so much with design, but with the technology and the society, how it operates.
So I'm not talking about sign, right? What I'm trying to say is that I'm not talking about Heidegger. So I'm not coming here from Heidegger and not any about this. What I'm trying to say is that the ways in which what I see with young people is who or what they identify with is really far removed often from our own time.
Right, but my point, sorry, just to clarify one sentence. It's not just kind of weird medieval knight profiles. It's like our profile right now. I think we're also like we're like right now doing profile work.
Yeah. Of course. Yeah. And
I don't think that's a bad thing.
yeah, and there's an obvious obvious difference between when the recording is on and when it's off.
Not really. I mean,
Well, no,
not there is a difference, of course, but the difference is only slight, I think, for me. And secondly, it's not that I feel kind of less myself when the recording.
No, but we're
I
speaking
feel
in a different language.
as much or even more myself during the recording.
Oh, okay, but when you say that, then you're coming into your own now, right?
Yes,
So, aha.
yes.
Now, and one other way of translating Heidegger, sorry, to translate or think of Heidegger's Eigentlichkeit is ownedness.
Of course,
We're beginning
yes.
to own ourselves, but
yes,
here's the twist: it's not a state, it's not a thing, it's not something you can reach. It's momentary. So
yes.
it's momentary coming into one's own. Then we're scattered again.
Yeah. And of course, it depends on in the mode of the profile. It depends also on validation and so forth by the general peer. But I don't want to go too much into it.
Yeah.
But this, as you say, like the reality, it depends on it has a lot to do with the hyper reality that we are currently right now in. And we have a greater awareness of that. We don't fear the hyper reality. As I'll try to bring it back to Baudrillard. There's no reason to fear or to be fearful about the hyper reality.
No, but there is a moment when you have to fear it. Is when you're walking around looking at your own profile or someone else's profile and the car hits you. Right? That's when you're all of a sudden hit by something that,
of course.
You know, your profile will buy you nothing. You live forever. That's the weird thing. We live forever, at least potentially. Well, not really, because the cloud can collapse also, and data gets lost, and data is basically unmineable at this point. Just as a side note, Peter Thiel's Palantir is going down because it cannot do what it pretends to do.
Can you explain that? I'm just curious.
Well, so I mean, so 10 years ago, when you flew into Heathrow Airport, HSBC, which is a major bank here and across the globe, they had advertisement, that's pretty say. You walked out the airplane. The first thing you saw was your data is your future. Your genetic data is the new gold. Blah blah blah. It was all about data, and I think that's now we're basically coming at the. So what I can gather is that there's not so much talk about big data anymore. Have you noticed? It's now all about AI. So big data has completely disappeared. Right. By the way, also Facebook's metaverse has completely been abandoned 2 years ago. The new mega trend, Nike, actually producing companies, Nike, Gucci, Volkswagen, etc. They bought real estate on the metaverse for millions, if not billions, and now that's been parked. It's done. It's over. There's no meta. So they've given up on this. But that's another. So big data is no longer really because so profiling. I don't want to. So for example, total digital surveillance is not possible precisely because there cannot be a perfect, to come back to the beginning, a perfect of the territory. Right. And big data is also now pushing against just limitations of calculation. Basically, what we have is huge data centers that take insane amounts of energy to cool them, to store, because that data is not a book. You print that book once, and this will be fine for 100 years if it's good print condition, or longer if it's good printing. Not the same with electronic storage. It needs constant fragmentation, etc. And that's, I think, pushing. So Palantir is this company that claims to be able to just get any set of data and then organize it perfectly. It's not really capable of doing this, and other companies are also not really capable of doing this. So we're also pushing against limitations in that regard. And yeah, but anyway,
you're basically saying data storage is a huge problem.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And data management also. Data management, yes. And so what I'm just trying to say is again, for lack of a better word, the real is constantly, or limitation, finitude is constantly
I see. Yes,
interfering
yes, I get it. Yeah,
with
now
the
I understand the
seeming,
point. Yes.
you know, with the seeming sort of deathlessness or eternity on the internet.
Right.
We're looking at a screen. The screen is always bright. There's no end to and the internet is bottomless, right? We can
Yes.
click, 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 and it goes on forever. But there is a moment where perhaps this can also just suffocate under its own weight, so that there's other
I
things.
fully agree with you on that, Johannes. And that's also again why I don't like. I'm not 100% a Baudrillard person.
Yeah.
I agree with it.
Yeah.
I fully agree with it.
Should we end on agreement or disagreement?
Yes, why not? Why not? Yeah.
But that notion that there can be moments of coming into one's own. And by the way, I would say that this it's in itself is not a coming back to an essence,
Right.
but is momentary. So it is
Exactly.
actually something that is generated now between us.
Yes.
And it can be in agreement and disagreement.
Right.
That you realize, oh, I disagree with this completely. And then you come into your own. It doesn't have to be this collapsing into let's all hold hands and be.
Of course, of course, of course. Yes. Yeah, so that was good. I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Me too.